Hi, welcome to the first ever Crosstalk. This is an opportunity for us as ministers and as friends to answer some of the questions that we know people are actually asking. Peter, Kane, and I meet almost every week to just be friends together and share life together. And we were talking recently and just sharing the fact that there are quite a few people that we have come across who are asking some of life's big questions, but don't really know where to go to find the answers. So this is an opportunity for us to try and answer some of the questions that have been sent in. Peter put a request out there on the internet, on Facebook, and these are some of the questions that came back. So the very first one, tiny little question. Kane, maybe you can kick us off. Who made God?
Who made God? Very good question. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when we read in the Genesis account, we hear of God created, and we don't hear of anything of the beginning before the creation. And so the big question is, well, who is God? Where did he come from? And has he always been there? And it's difficult, I think, for us to be understanding of this because we're animals that are trapped in a four-dimensional time and space, where we have time as a clear line, and obviously the three dimensions that we experience. And so it's kind of a big question. The thing is, I'm a mathematician by my past. I studied mathematics and have a mathematics degree. And one of the things that was asked is, there are probably more than four dimensions in this universe. And so if something exists outside of the four dimensions we understand, then it becomes quite difficult to understand what that might look like. I believe that God exists outside these time constraints and actually sits above and beyond time. And so therefore, God is not created. He's not a created being. He has always been and always will be. And that's pretty much what the Bible says about him as well. So there's a kind of a sense of him always existing. And so that's what I think, and I strongly feel. If I had a God that was created by something else, who created that? And there's a chain of questions that link into that as well. So therefore, something had to start from somewhere. And when we think the Big Bang Theory as well, from nothing, everything was formed. I think, interesting enough, Genesis tells us in the beginning there was nothing and everything was formed in one instant. So there's a compelling scientific kind of reasoning behind us understanding that God has always existed, always will exist, and has been consistent throughout the universe. Well, that's my thought and my kind of penny's worth to start the question off. I don't know, Pete, have you got anything else to add to that?
Well, yes, I mean, Kane, I think that's a great answer, and I do agree with everything you said. The bits I understand, and
Yeah.
but I think that I heard recently, I have to say, a great response, which I wish was my own, but it wasn't. It was one I heard on Premier Christian Radio, and he said if you got a table with two blocks on it, and a red block on top of a blue block, and then a table, then if someone said, right, what's the red block standing on? Well, it's standing on the blue block. What's the blue block resting on? Well, it's resting on the table. What's the table resting on? Well, it's resting on the ground. Or what's the ground resting on? Or nothing. The ground doesn't need anything to rest on. It just is there. And I thought that was a fantastic way of explaining it. That, like Kane was saying, that God has always been. And if you take God out of the equation, you will have to come, for life to exist, you will have to come to a point where somehow something came from nothing. And but I think like the ground doesn't need to rest on anything. God did not need to be created. God always has and always will be.
That's brilliant. Can I just chip in as well?
Yeah.
I became a Christian when I was 18, and I think I was always aware that God was perhaps there, but I didn't, wasn't able to put a face to the name, if you like. So I always had a vague belief in God, but I had some really big questions on my journey to faith, and one of them was about the universe. So I used to lie in bed at night. This is the kind of teenager I was. I used to lie in bed at night and used to think about the size of the universe, and I just, like, my mind couldn't get around just the vastness of the universe. And so, I obviously knew about the scientific theory of the Big Bang and how everything kind of came from this kind of one point and expanded out, and how, since Hubble, they've discovered that the universe is expanding, and all of that. So the big questions in my mind before I became a Christian was, well, if the universe is expanding, what is it expanding into? And if it came from this tiny point, like all time and all matter came from this one point, what was around that little point before it happened, and what caused it to happen? And when I became a Christian, I felt like the answers to those questions were kind of wrapped up in who God is. So God is not confined by space or time. He's outside of that. So he can be in yesterday, today, and forever all at the same time. And even though the universe is so vast, he's even bigger because he set the whole thing in motion. And I'll come back to what you said, Peter. I just love the way you put it. I think everything is limited and dependent on something else. And so you kind of trace that all the way back. And then at the beginning of time itself, and the beginning of when matter came into existence, there has to be some uncaused cause that kind of set all these things in motion. Otherwise, you just get this infinite regress back into, my mind can't get around that anyway. But the thing about God is, even though lots of people might have a vague belief in like a higher power or, a God of this religion or that religion, what I love about the God of Christianity is, even though he's so awesome and so big and that he set the whole thing in motion, he's also a personal God, and he knows me and I can know him. And the reason I can know him is that Jesus made him known. So when I look at Jesus, I can discover what God's truly like, even though my mind is so tiny and not able to grasp the bigness of God. When I look at Jesus, he shows me what God's like. So that's my little answer to that question.
Yeah. And I think also then leading into that, when you read sort of the Genesis account and then go into John, you see both the same words in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that is a clear indication that Jesus has always been as well. And so I think, we often think that he arrived at Christmas, but actually the reality is God in the three persons was already existing before the beginning.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah. So I think that sort of widens out that question a little bit, I think, and looks at it a bit deeper and says, actually, it's more than just God. I mean, well, it is God, of course, but as we understand God, it might be that we just see a creator God, but actually, at the beginning of time, there wasn't just the creator God. There was the Spirit hovering over the waters. There was Christ who was there, looking at the world in compassion and love, and sort of almost saying, should we put that over there? And do you think that would look quite nice and pink over there, or something like that? It's just, and the partnership that was there already. There's a fellowship within that Trinity that then humanity emulates in the way that we live our lives.
Yeah, and sorry, I know this isn't the question, but just kind of picking up on some of those themes. I think we get clues about God in what he's created, don't we? So, we would obviously talk about creation and there being a creator, but even, the most ardent atheist, if they're a scientist, will look and see intricacy and what I can only describe as design. Even in DNA, even a language, which kind of says to me that there's a mind behind all of this. And in the Bible, it says the heavens declare the glory of God. So when I look up into the night sky and I look at the stars, there's something in me that goes, wow. And when I look at a sunset, or when I stand looking up at a mountain, there's something in me that just responds to it. And the Bible says God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. So it's almost like something that he's put in us, because we're created in the image of God, responds to something that he reveals of himself in the things that he's made. So yeah, I think everybody experiences that, but not everyone's able to describe what it is that they're experiencing.
Yes.
I go with both of you on these things, and I think I remember as a teenager sort of thinking about belief in God, and looking up at the stars, and it was that which really struck a chord with me. Just, I wasn't looking up at a flat picture. I was looking up at something with immense depth, so that what I was looking at was something that just went on and on and on, further and further back, rather than just a flat picture of stars. And I could not accept that had just happened all by itself.
It's interesting, actually. I don't know if you ever saw, there was a program about 11 years ago with Brian Cox, who did a story about the universe.
I love him.
He actually used the words miracle, that we are here and that the universe came about. And I think it's interesting. I think people specialize in certain areas of science. And the problem is you've got astrophysics, say, for example, is one area. You've got biology and all that sort of thing, and evolution, or whatever they want to talk about. But actually, each individual recognizes there's something quite special about what we have. And they can't quite put their finger on it. And the problem is, then you expand that out and you look wider, and you look at astrophysics, you look at the universe, you look at biology, the way humans are put together. I mean, it's not an accident. And it's a little bit like if you went to the beach and you saw a sandcastle, you wouldn't go, gee, those waves made it really well. It's just, it's impossible. And so, again, that whole thing, second law of thermodynamics, which basically says, that we are degrading, not getting better as a universe. So how did this all come about? Well, clearly there is the creator's signature, I think, across the universe, and those things. And I think you can't look at things individually. You've got to look at them as a whole picture. Otherwise, you could easily come down to a scientific argument. But actually, the reality is much bigger than that, much more impossible that it happened. And suddenly, humanity exists, and planets exist with water that are held together by gravity. All of these things. Just
and I think there's so much beauty and order in creation that people can measure it, and there's some things that are just predictable because there are laws in nature. That's why science can be done. So I sometimes think, how can you kind of look at that stuff and not be in awe? Like, even if you're not a Christian, if you have no faith, how can you not be in awe that there's such order and apparent design in the creation, in nature? And I sometimes think, if my wife wrote some squiggles on a piece of paper and I didn't know the language that she was writing in, I couldn't understand like the mind that was behind those squiggles on the piece of paper. But if I knew the language, then I would be able to understand the mind behind the squiggles on the piece of paper. And I think when you look, I think scientists can look at what God's made, see all of the intricacies of the design, and if they had a worldview that permitted there to be a God, they would be going, wow, that is so amazing. That is just so amazing. But we come with worldviews that we don't even realize that we have these filters that we look at the world through. So some scientists, not all scientists, the guy who discovered DNA and all of that, he's a Christian, isn't he? And he once said, before he was a Christian, he had this fixed idea that there was no God, because he had this naturalist worldview, but he didn't apply scientific method to the investigation of whether there was a God or not. So he just had a worldview that informed his perspective. And we're hands up, me, Kane, Peter, we come at this from a definite worldview that allows for there to be not only a creator but a personal God who we can know. and other people have a worldview. But what I always say to people is, don't discount God until you've looked at the evidence. Once you've looked at the evidence, if the evidence then, leads you in the direction of discounting God, then fine. But don't discount God without looking at the evidence, because if you look closely enough, the evidence is everywhere. It's so amazing. Well, should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question, that's some great question, by the way, whoever asked that first one. That's,
really
that's
good.
a big question. The second question is, if I have a personal faith, why do I need to go to church? Peter, do you want to kick us off with that one?
I can try. I think it is a very common question, and I think the answer is nowhere in the Bible does it say you need to go to church, and so there is nothing written scriptural that says that's what you have got to do. And there are many people who can't. There are people in parts of the world where it's illegal to be a Christian, and so they have no church to go to, and they will worship in secret. They may be in solitary confinement. So for some people, it is actually not possible. But what I would say is I think it's entirely advisable, because that's where you feed off other people, you learn from other people, and you have that wonderful connection with other people. You may not have too much in common with some of them, but you have in common that faith, that love of Jesus, and that recognition that we are all accepted. I have heard people say, well, I don't want to go to church because it's full of hypocrites. Well, yes, it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm afraid you're absolutely right. We go to church not because we're perfect, but because we know we're not. And we want to learn more about the love of Jesus and his acceptance, and we do want to change. We may not be very good at it, but that's what we want. And I do think that with the pandemic, that our definition of what church is has changed anyway. And so there are people who will have attended church by going online rather than in person, but also listening to services on the radio and on television. And that, for some people, has become their church. And so the short answer is, for me, that no, you don't have to, but I strongly recommend it.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Peter's right, but I think also if I go to the Bible and I look at, say, 1 Corinthians particularly and 12, it talks about the body being the church. So we are all part of the body. And Paul sort of points out that actually, I'll read it, because if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body. So it's almost like a Christian saying, I don't belong to the church. And let's face it, I'm talking about church of people, not of a building that we go to, but more about the people, because that is the real church. Paul is basically saying, if you think you don't belong to the body, then you're wrong. You do. And that's quite strong words. But Paul is writing into a context of people thinking they know better than everybody else. And I think the place of church is actually to iron sharpens iron, the idea that we come together. We may feel passionately different, and that's okay, because actually church is a place to practice forgiveness of each other. If God forgives us and loves us and Christ forgives us, then we should rub along shoulders with other people, because actually you're going to be in a relationship with those people. And when you're in a relationship with people, pain follows. It's inevitable, because we're all human. There's a great song by a guy called Eli that goes, I thank the Lord that there's a heaven full of hypocrites like me. And I think, I used to think that similar lines, church is full of hypocrites and I don't want to be there. And but actually it was to my detriment when I didn't go. And it's only been recently, and God has a great sense of humor when he puts me in leadership of a church now. But when we go there, the reality of our faith, the road meets the rubber. And that's the important thing. It's a place where we grow our faith in amongst people, like Pete said, like-minded in Christ. If the body is the church, the head is Christ, then we are very much driven by his will for our lives. And to think that you can do it on your own is a real dangerous supposition. I mean, it just basically you think you know better than everybody else. That's not a healthy faith and not a good faith. You know, we have to come together. And I mean, that's one thing I've really enjoyed about meeting with Pete and Damien, is that we've been together. And you know, we might disagree on some areas of theology. That's fine. The principle is we all believe, all three of us believe, that Christ is at the center of our faith. And without him, we are nothing. We are just broken individuals trying to fumble our way through life. And so Christ gives purpose. And if he gives purpose, he's got a calling on our lives. And that calling is lived out in the church, because actually the church is a place where mission should take place. And so I'm going to go even further to say that you should go to your local church. I don't think you should travel far to a church, because actually, if you are you serious about mission, then your mission is in your community, where you rub along shoulders those other people that aren't going to church, don't know Christ yet. And actually, as a shared body, we have that responsibility together. And part of it is actually turning up, being angry with somebody, but actually learning to forgive. And actually, the way that the church interacts becomes a beautiful thing for people to see. And as they look from the outside in, you see, we're used to a world full of conflict and hate and revenge and all of those other things. When they see a church that behaves in a very different way to what the world should, then it becomes attractive. And that's a real key point. We all must go. We must not think about, you know, we must not think of ourselves more highly than we ought, from Romans 12, but judge ourselves with sober judgment. And the reality is, when we judge ourselves against Christ, we all fall short. And church is a place where I fall short. But I come with other people, broken, and people who are far from perfect. But in it, we work through things together. We work through the Bible together. We work through being sinners together to a point where we recognize the desperate need for Christ. So, and I don't think you can do that necessarily on your own. So, if anything, a little bit like the coal taken out of the fire and put on one side, it will quickly burn out. Whereas if you're amongst other believers, it sort of has it's self-generating. It's a much tighter space and place. I will put proviso: if the church teaches that Christ is not king, then it's not a church.
No.
So the key thing to say is the judgment on a church is, are they putting Christ at the very center of what they do? And are they saying that Christ is the only one who can forgive my sins? That's a church. That's the body of Christ. And that's because they've put Christ at the head of their church and nothing else. So for my answer is absolutely, and local. So yeah.
You know, I listen, this often happens to me. I listen to you both and I'm thinking, oh, I'd really like to be part of your churches. The way you talk. Just a little perspective from my point of view as well. So I was 18 when I became a Christian, and the very first church I went to was Corby Baptist Church. And I'd never been to a church. I was petrified. Like, what do you do when you go to a church? Like, do you kind of stand up? When do you stand up? When do you sit down? I didn't know any of the songs. I didn't know what people said. I didn't know how to behave. So I nearly backed out, but my friend just like encouraged me to come and just like be myself. And anyway, I walked through the door. There was this little old lady with a bowl cut. It looked like she had put a bowl on her head and cut around it. She was the sweetest little thing. She was in her 80s and she was Welsh. And she was like, "Oh, Cariad, it's so good to see you." And she kind of sat me down next to her and she got all of these like dusty toffees out of her bag and started giving them to me. And I just felt really loved. I'd never met her before, but she just loved me, like even without me having to prove anything. And it was the same. Like I met countless people that first time, and then I kept going back. And these people just knew how to love well. And like before that, as a teenager, I always felt like I had to prove myself or be someone that I wasn't, to try and impress people. But then they didn't really like the person I was trying to be because it was fake. And then I went to this place of just random people of all ages and all backgrounds, and there was just acceptance and love. That was my first experience of church. So somebody said something really helpful to me early on, and it was that because most people think churches are the buildings that we meet in. So Kane, you've got a really beautiful building that you meet in, 800 years old. Yeah, and it's amazing. It's gorgeous. It's the kind of place you'd want to get married. but that's not the church.
Yeah.
That's the building that the church meets in.
Absolutely.
And Peter, you've got another, not quite as old building in Gretton, another beautiful building. You've just had some work done to it. It's looking really amazing inside. But that's not the church. That's where the church meets, isn't it? That's
Absolutely.
where the church gathers, if you like. But the church is a collection of other believers, all ages, all backgrounds, both sexes, who have one thing in common, and that's Jesus. And so I often talk about church as being family. We actually don't have our own building that we meet in on Sundays. We meet in a school, and that helps us in a way to differentiate. So we know that the church meets in the school, and the school isn't the church. And so in our minds, it's just a little bit easier. But the church is family, it's relationship, it's brothers and sisters with the same daddy in heaven. That's the way I think of it. It's a community. And so the question is, can I have a personal faith and not go to church? Two answers. One is, if you're really a Christian, you are part of the church. That's just the nature of being a Christian. You're part of this family of believers that isn't just, in Weldon and Gretton and Corby, but right across the world, going back through time and even in heaven. And you're part of that. You can't help being part of that if you're a Christian. But the second part to that answer is, if you're truly a Christian, there'll be something in you that will be drawn to other Christians, I think. Some people have been hurt by churches. Some people have been hurt by Christianity and have had bad experiences. All I would say is churches are made up of imperfect people, and churches aren't supposed to be places where perfect people go, more like hospitals where hurting and broken people find increasing measures of healing. And that happens through a relationship with God because of what Jesus has done. And so I always say to people, don't come expecting perfection. If you find a perfect church, don't join it because you'll spoil it. But church is a place where we can work out this faith stuff together and hopefully become a little bit more like Jesus on that journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Guys, really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Definitely. And then they're good questions as well, because I think, there must be so many people out there trying to think about these things and process them. But I think, find a good local church, go and join it if you're not already, because I think you will find real blessing in it. And you will find out more about yourself and your walk with Christ doing that. And it will stretch you. I'm not, there's a wonderful book I've got. It's called Relationships, a Mess Worth Making. And I think it is, in Christian terms, it is a messy relationship sometimes because we are broken and hurt and we have our own issues that we need to process and deal with. But I do think it's better in community. But under that authority of Christ. And that's the key thing. If we're all pointing in the same direction, pointing at the same person, then the church is not navel gazing, but actually looking up and looking out. And I think that's the other key thing. I think if the church starts introspectively looking, I think it can be quite a dangerous place. But when it's focused on mission and looking at Jesus and finding more about him, it becomes a place of life, I guess. Just real life.
Can I? Sorry, Peter, go for it.
I was going to say, I think the two things that Kane has brought out that are just so key are about Jesus being king, and I mean, if I was going to be put off going to church, it would have happened when I was about 16, when I felt some lady was rude to me, but she wasn't the reason why I was going to church. It was because of Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what is so important. But also, I forgot what I was going to say, but it was another about the local church. I think that is really important as well, because then you can have an effect on the community. But I wouldn't want to go too much on the sort of negatives about being hurt in church, because there are some fabulous people, and you can learn from people, and people who will be there to help and to talk with people who are on the same journey as you are. They may be in a different place. They may be coming at it from a completely different angle, but you learn and you grow and you learn to love, and you learn that acceptance. And churches have their faults, families do, but when Jesus is right at the center of it, churches
just work.
Churches are the place to be.
Yeah, brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So somebody once said, church is the church, like universal, is the one organization that exists primarily for the benefit of its non-members.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you gather together as a church, it's not supposed to be like an insular, inward-looking thing. Actually, we come together, but the output, the overflow of that should be that we are a blessing to the community that we live in, and that we care deeply about the things that are going on in our towns and villages. So yeah, I think that's great. I always get, when I meet somebody for the first time, I'm always a bit nervous to tell them what I do. I don't know if you guys have the same thing, but it either opens up a conversation or it completely closes it down. So so one person I heard who was a minister, he used to take lots of flights, and he got into the habit of being creative about how he described what he did. So he used to describe himself as like a public speaker. So, that's quite acceptable, isn't it? And then later on, he developed this kind of this thing that he used to say, which was, oh yes, I work for this international movement with outlets in almost every town and city across the world. We have schools and hospitals and orphanages. We feed the poor and we help the broken. And we specialize in the area of behavioral alteration. And they're like, wow, that sounds amazing. What is that? And he says, it's the church. So church is, with all of its faults, is amazing. And I would just say to people, like, you have a stereotype in your head of what church is like. Church is the people. And if you find a church where people love God and love each other and love the community around them, they really love the Bible, get a modern translation of the Bible and read it, because it's amazing. Start in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and read about Jesus. And churches that believe that the Bible is important and have Jesus center stage, those are the churches that are really worth joining. And I know Peter's, Cane, St. John's in the Old Village, Living Faith Temple, United Reformed Church, the Methodist Church. There are so many churches in Corby, and if you find a church full of people who aren't perfect but who love Jesus on a journey together towards God, and growing in their faith, then it's a real adventure.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is two things that just reminded me when you're talking is that churches are about interdependence. So the idea that we need each other. Yeah. And I think that's really important as we live in a world that we should be independent. And actually we're countercultural that way. Yeah. We need interdependence on each other because we need each other there to support each other. And the second thing is unity does not mean uniformity.
That's right.
So the key thing is we are united under Christ, but it doesn't mean we perform the same functions. We have to be the same kind of person. We don't even have to be the same personality type. We're all different. And that's the wonderful thing about church. It's a diverse social economic group of people that come together under one banner. And I think, that's another really important part of church as well.
Brilliant. Guys, should we wrap up the conversation?
Yeah.
I've loved this. This is brilliant.
Yeah,
we should do this more.
Yeah. We'll do it next week.
Yeah, shall we? All right. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for everyone who sent in questions. We actually have a couple more questions that we haven't had time for today, but we'll revisit those and hopefully post those online as well. If you have any questions, please do post underneath this video and let us know what your questions are, and we'll do our best to answer them in the days to come. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.